In this episode, we look at citing evidence from sources. Hi, boys and girls. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to define the terms evidence and sources, explain the importance of using evidence to support statements, use evidence to support statements made. Analyze the picture below. What do you think is happening in this picture? What do you think the detectives are looking for? So we see one here, two. They're looking for pieces of evidence. If you said evidence, you are 100% correct. In order to solve their crimes, the officers or detectives must find clues or evidence that will help them to find the criminals or to help them to solve the crime. They must present this evidence to the judge in order to have justice served, or in other words, for them to win the case. Without this evidence, the detectives or their lawyers will not have solid arguments to present in courts. Why am I saying all of this? Just as how evidence is important to solve cases, providing evidence in our writing is also extremely important in presenting solid or valid arguments to our readers or in our essays. To gather evidence for our writing pieces, we must engage in research. Here is a simple research for you to complete. Work with a friend or classmate to gather information about the importance of preserving our Jamaican culture. You may use textbooks available to you at school, in your classes or school library, or you may use your devices, phones, tablets, and computers to do some research online. As you do your research, ensure that you write down your main points and the names of sources that you got the information from. You will be asked to use this information later in the lesson. Plain. When writing informative or argumentative pieces, providing evidence to support our statements is a very important research and study skill that you need to apply. Evidence is any piece of information or fact that is used to prove that a statement is true or valid. Evidence is used to support the statements being made by a writer. It also allows the writer to give credit to the author of the sources from which they got the information. It also helps the reader to be convinced that the arguments being presented by the writer are true or valid statements, and as such are believable. All pieces of evidence must come from a source. A source is any place or person from which information comes. There are many sources available to us. However, not all sources are reliable. This means that the information provided from some sources are not always true or accurate. It is important that we pay close attention and do thorough research to ensure that the information we collect from the sources that we have access to are accurate and reliable. Some examples of reliable sources include news reports, newspapers, journals, photographs, research data, documentaries, textbooks, etc. In journalism, people may be classified as reliable or primary sources. So if you go to the person and talk to them directly, that's a primary source. When you use information from sources in your writing pieces, this is called citing. There are many ways to cite evidence from sources. Citing the information also prevents an act known as plagiarism. Plagiarism refers to taking or using another person's work or words as your own without giving credit. In other words, you use the information without stating who or where the information came from. The sentence starters in the box below are ways in which you can indicate that you are citing evidence from sources. Additionally, when citing or using information from your sources, you should also paraphrase the information. To paraphrase means to put the information in your own words. This shows that you understand what you have read and also helps to prevent plagiarism. Using and explaining text evidence. First, cite, then explain. According to the text, this shows that the author states this means that on page so and so it states that, and this proves that, or this explains how. One example is, and this is important because based on what I read, the evidence shows, or from this I know. For instance, this reveals that, for example, in other words, or this describes how, on page so and so I noticed. This supports the answer because. So these are some clues or prompts that show that you are using and explaining text evidence. Elaborate. Now that you have done your detective job, gathering your evidence in the exploration activity above, it is time to use this evidence to support your statements. Share some of the information you have gathered with your other classmate or your teacher. Ensure that you use the sentence starters to indicate the source from which you receive the information. You could say, for example, based on what I read in the Macmillan Social Studies textbook, it is important to preserve our culture so we can keep the country's uniqueness alive. From this, I know that without the preservation of our culture, we might lose the aspects of our culture that our country is recognized for. Evaluate using the information you have gathered in your research and the knowledge you learned about using evidence to support your writing. Write an essay explaining 3 reasons why it is important to preserve our Jamaican culture. In this episode, we were looking at citing evidence from sources. Now you should be able to define the terms evidence and sources. Explain the importance of using evidence to support statements and use evidence to support statements. I want to go back to a few sections here. This is what evidence is. This is what a source is, why it's important. And remember this table here that shows how we can use and explain text evidence. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.